You're with the briefing here on BBC News. The headlines. Hurricane Dorian has caused widespread damage in the Bahamas, ripping roofs from buildings and causing severe flooding. The Prime Minister said it was the saddest day of his life. There's been a day of chaos at Hong Kong International Airport as protesters blocked road and rail links and forced dozens of flights to be cancelled. Britain's Conservative MPs have been given a blunt message by party chiefs: block a no-deal Brexit and be barred from elections. So let's look at some of those stories and others in more detail, what the global media is saying about these stories. So we start with the front page of today's Times and that warning that I've just mentioned to Tory MPs from Boris Johnson, that they'll be expelled from the party if they join forces with Labour this week to try and halt a no-deal Brexit. Meanwhile, the Financial Times says a Labour government would confiscate about £300 billion worth of shares in 7,000 large companies and hand them to workers in one of the biggest state raids on the private sector ever to take place in a Western democracy. South China Morning Post, of course, is focusing on the ongoing protests in Hong Kong, where the anti-government protesters brought chaos to its international airport on Sunday, in particular forcing travellers to walk part of the way to the city after crippling train services and blocking roads. In the independent business section, China and the US imposed extra tariffs on each other's goods. This started on Sunday at the beginning of September. In the latest escalation of the trade war, Beijing's levy of 5% on US crude oil marked the first time the fuel's been targeted since the two countries began the so-called trade war more than a year ago now. And finally, this is our talking point today on social media. KFC's plant-based version of its classic fried chicken sold out within hours after being tested at one of its chain's Atlanta stores. That's in Atlanta, Georgia. The trial launch of nuggets and boneless wings made from plant-based Beyond Meat appeared to be a huge hit with their customers. Who knew? Well, Oliver Cornock is back, editor-in-chief of Oxford Business Group. Let's get stuck in, Oliver. So earlier we were talking about this this move on the part of the whip within the Tory party, apparently ringing up the Conservative rebel MPs to give them this warning. If you were to act in rebellion this week, you'll pay for it. Just tell us what the Times has to say about this.
Well, the Times is saying that tomorrow, Tuesday, sort of the first day back at school for those who sit in the House of Commons, that they're going to be allowed to seize control of parliamentary business and vote on pushing through a no deal, i.e. this ability to prevent the Prime Minister from negotiating, saying we can walk away, no deal. Now, Boris Johnson says, actually, that's a disaster from my negotiating position. And my MPs on my side of the party will be expelled. They'll have the whip removed from them. It means they can't vote. Now, that can, of course, be reinstated.
They'll be expelled if they choose to side with the Labour Party and others within Parliament who are trying to prevent a no-deal.
This is people who are opposed to a no-deal Brexit. And he's saying that actually, Michael Gove in the article is also saying, well, we might not abide by the legislation anyway. So we really are up for a very busy week, I think, and it's only Monday morning.
Yeah, it's an extremely busy week. And we'll see how this week progresses. But time is of the essence, isn't it? Because of the fact that, you know, parliamentary activity will be suspended sooner than many expected.
Absolutely. And it comes back to the problem for both sides, for both the opposition, the official opposition, and the ruling Conservative Party here, that they do not have a particularly strong majority either way. Of course, the Tories only have one person. And the Labour Party's position is still very murky on Brexit.
All right, well, we'll talk about this all week. So let's swiftly move on to the front page of the Financial Times. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. Talking about, this is analysis done by the Financial Times and the law firm Clifford Chance, which looks at what might happen if there were to be a Labour government, because there's so much conversation about there being a general election quite soon. It's interesting reading. Give us your take on this.
Well, on the face of it, UK Inc. needs this like a hole in the head. This is the sort of headline with a huge amount of uncertainty that's just going to make investors think, golly, if there's a general election looming, which let's be honest, all of the optics suggest that's not going to be terribly far away. This is positioning. This is the Labour Party positioning themselves in their quite radical left-wing agenda. Now, anybody who's watched UK politics over the last couple of years will know that this is actually entirely predictable. And at the same time, there are certain elements of this story. The two main elements are the idea that UK companies that employ over 250 people should have to have a sort of share. They have to share some of their earnings. That would be up to £500 a year. And then the rest of that, it's a stealth tax, would go to the government. Now, a lot of businesses already do have employee share options, so it's just that this is legislating for it and on a very, very large scale. It is quite dramatic. The other one is about actually legislating against the landlords in the UK and the right to buy, a sort of, if you like, Thatcher Mark II right to buy. Quite radical. There are over, I think the article says here, 2.6 million landlords in the UK. This is a big part of the UK economy. And what a lot of our European friends don't understand is the majority of UK people own their own homes. It's a big part of the economy. It's a big part of the bond market. It's a big part of the financial services industry, which, of course, the left-wing Labour, the wing of the Labour Party that's particularly radical, is very opposed to that. To me, in conclusion, this comes down to electioneering.
Oh, absolutely. It comes down to electioneering, which many expecting the Queen's speech will absolutely be about that as well. All this exciting new package that Boris Johnson is telling us he will deliver, which is why he needs this extra time to put it together. The question is, what will this do? This kind of analysis that we see on the front page of the Financial Times today, people who read this, whether they are a chief executive of a company or someone who works for a company, I mean, what do you think people will make of it?
Well, on one level, it's in the Financial Times, which, of course, is broadly pro-free market capitalism.
Absolutely.
So you might say, well, of course they're going to be particularly negative on this. This is only one of 5 days, as I understand it. This is a week of coverage on this story. So it'll be interesting to see what the rest of the week holds on this. But this definitely is not good news for UK businesses.
But some might argue the opposite. They might say, actually, many companies already who have workers who have share ownership, who are involved in how the companies run from that perspective. So where the chief executive is not having to answer to investors all the time and shareholders all the time, but actually the employees in those companies, they see great success, they see growth, and those workers, their morale is high, they feel much more ownership of the company they work for. And
I think that's definitely true. In the Financial Times has been very keen to point out that it does work quite well. There are other models to consider.
All right, let's look now at South China Morning Post, and there's lots of dramatic images in today's South China Morning Post of what happened in Hong Kong on Sunday. And Saturday, of course, protests that turned extremely violent, but also how these protesters effectively managed to prevent normal activity at the international airport again. Many of them weren't allowed inside the airport this time, but they just blocked the roads, they blocked the trains, they blocked access. They
didn't close the airport down from flights, which they did 4 weeks ago. This is into its 13th week, Sally, and actually it's interesting. The rhetoric in this paper, which is, of course, arguably quite the South China Morning Post has quite a government spin on it. But the language here is changing. It's talking about masked radicals. I do worry about this. It's shifting. The other angle here is, of course, that the average Hong Konger on the street, whilst they might have sympathy with the protesters, in the 13th week are getting pretty sick and tired of it. I was in an airport in Dubai chatting to someone from Hong Kong, and actually they are very sympathetic. They feel very strongly about the rescinding of democratic rights, blah, 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 towards China. But they're also saying, look, I've got to get my kids to school. Got to get my kids there. I think this is becoming a bit tiring. 32 stations vandalised. Vandalism and destroying infrastructure is always very negative, isn't it? Well, we keep an eye on how it develops and how the general strike goes today and tomorrow. I'm going to skip to the story about KFC, because the trade war is something we talk about a lot, and I can send that story out in more detail anyway, the trade war. But what sandwich war, says the New York Times? KFC sells out a plant-based chicken in Atlanta. This was a test, wasn't it, on the part of KFC, and it would seem there's a real appetite for plant-based foods. Queuing around the block. Absolutely. I'm surprised, are you? Well, not really. In the UK here, we have a bakery called Greggs, and they have a sort of iconic sausage roll. They introduced a vegan sausage roll, and it's proved extremely popular. Now, I don't think for any minute, and this is the premise of this New York Times article, it's not encouraging people to be vegetarian or vegan. It's playing more towards the increasing amount of people that choose not to eat meat every day. Flexitarianism. We've had pescatarianism, we've had fruitarians, now we've got flexitarians, which, let's be honest, is what what our grandmothers used to say to us, everything in moderation.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are you?
A flexitarian.
I must admit, I'm there too. I'm a flexitarian as well. We've heard from many viewers on this, and many of you have mixed opinions. Quite a few have actually mentioned whether this is actually a healthier option or not. There's real discussions about to what extent is this better.
Well, what chemicals have been used in this plant production, that worries me. A huge amount of the plant-based stuff is also not necessarily very environmentally friendly. The inputs are chemicals, fertiliser.
I mean, one viewer here, Colin H, on Twitter says, it's no more healthy than chicken, is it? It's still actually deep fried. That's one comment. We've got one as well here. So iSultan says, so they need to change their name to KFP instead of KFC. Thanks so much for coming in, Ollie. It's been great to have you on the programme. Thank you too for your company this morning on The Briefing. Whatever you're up to today, I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you soon.